Hey everyone, welcome back. So today we're going deep on a topic you guys sent us a ton of articles about, a potential peace deal in Ukraine. And just a heads up, these articles were all from January 15th, 2025.
Yeah, so by the time you're hearing this, who knows? Maybe they've already figured everything out and there's world peace and we're all hanging out.
Wouldn't that be nice?
Right. But even if that is the case, I think it's still super interesting to go back to this specific moment in time. Because, we had President-elect Trump about to take office, and he made some pretty big promises about ending the war, like immediately, on day one, I think was the phrase. And we're going to see as we go through these articles, things were a little more complicated than that. So that's what we're going to try to figure out today. What were the main sticking points? What were the plans that people were putting forward? And was peace even a real possibility back then? Yeah, one thing that jumps out right away is that day one promise. Well, it pretty much vanished. The language started shifting to very quickly. And at this point, January 15th, there isn't even a real timeline.
Right. It's all very vague. And it's not just the timeline that's unclear, right? There were all these different peace plans floating around, each with its own quirks. And then on top of that, you've got Russia. And their position has been, well, let's just say it hasn't been straightforward.
Yeah, very much we're open to talks, but also some of your ideas are terrible kind of vibe.
Exactly. One article even had a quote from Russia's UN ambassador saying the peace plans from Trump's advisors were nothing of interest. It's like they're playing this game of diplomatic chess where they want to seem open to the idea of peace, but they're also not really giving anything away.
Right. And we have to remember the situation on the ground, too. Russia had made some big gains in the months leading up to this point. So from Putin's perspective, why rush into a deal when he thinks he can just wait and get even more concessions later?
It's like they had all this momentum, and that definitely gives you leverage in any negotiation. So you've got this power dynamic already in play, then you add in all these different personalities, advisors whispering in everyone's ears, the whole world watching. It's a lot. But that's why we're here, right? To try and make sense of it all.
Exactly. So let's maybe start with the people involved on Trump's side. You've got folks like Keith Kellogg. He was Trump's envoy for Russia and Ukraine. Kellogg, at this point, was saying he wanted a solution within 100 days. But even some people within Trump's own team thought that was unrealistic. Like John Herbst, the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, called it way, way too optimistic.
So even within Trump's own circle, there was disagreement on how quickly this could all be resolved. And then you have people like Cyrus Vance and Richard Grenell also throwing their ideas into the mix.
Right. Lots of different opinions on how to approach this whole thing.
It's almost like they were just throwing everything in the wall and seeing what sticks, which I guess makes sense when you've got a brand new president who's made these huge promises about peace.
Yeah, the pressure was definitely on. And then on the Ukrainian side, you've got Zelensky, who, let's be real, has been a pretty strong leader throughout all this. And he's made it clear that he wants NATO membership for Ukraine. He even has this whole victory plan that includes taking back all the territory lost to Russia, Crimea included.
Wow. So any deal that takes NATO off the table is going to be a hard sell for him, especially with all this talk about potential security guarantees, like a demilitarized zone patrolled by European troops. That sounds good in theory, but who's going to pay for all that? And is it really going to be enough to stop Russia from trying something again in the future?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And
Right.
then you add in the possibility of Biden and the Europeans sending even more aid to Ukraine, which could actually make things harder for Trump to negotiate a deal because now Ukraine has more options and they don't have to rely on Trump as much.
So that could weaken his leverage, right? And then, of course, you can't forget about the U.S. Congress. Some lawmakers might be totally against giving more money to Ukraine, especially if they think it's basically rewarding Russia for, starting this whole thing.
It's a tough situation all around. And we haven't even gotten into the specifics of each of these peace plans yet.
Right. We've got Kellogg's proposal with the conditional aid, Vance's idea about the demilitarized zone, and then Grenell's autonomous zones, which, to be honest, I'm still not entirely sure what that even means.
Yeah, that one's a bit of a mystery. But each of these plans comes with its own set of risks and potential consequences.
And that's what we're going to dive into next. We're going to look at each of these plans and try to figure out what were the potential downsides. What could have gone wrong? Because, as we've seen, even the best intentions can sometimes lead to unintended consequences.
Absolutely. And in a situation as complex as this, understanding those potential consequences is crucial.
So buckle up, everyone, because we're about to go even deeper into this whole Ukraine peace deal saga.
This is where it gets really interesting.
All right. So we've got this whole mess of competing interests and these big ambitious plans. But it feels like every plan also has these potential downsides. Like, what are the consequences of all this? Not just for Ukraine, but for the whole world.
Yeah, that's the key question, isn't it? And for Ukraine, I think one of the most immediate consequences is, well, they could lose territory. If they end up just freezing the conflict lines where they were in January 2025, that basically means Russia gets to keep all the land they took.
And Zelensky's not going to be happy about that, right? He's made it very clear that he wants to take back all of Ukraine, including Crimea.
Right. So any deal that involves giving up land is going to be really tough for him to accept. And it raises a really important question. Would a deal like that actually make Ukraine less secure in the long run?
What do you mean?
Well, some people argue that if Putin sees he can just take land and get away with it, he'll be tempted to do it again.
It's like the old saying, give them an inch and they'll take a mile. And then what happens to NATO? If Ukraine gets basically abandoned by the West and has to give in to Russia's demands, doesn't that make NATO look really weak?
Oh, absolutely. It would send a terrible message to other countries that are worried about Russia, like, hey, maybe don't count on NATO to actually protect you.
And wouldn't that be exactly what Putin wants?
Yeah, he's been trying to undermine NATO for years. So a deal like that would be a huge win for him. And it could embolden him to, start putting pressure on other countries like Moldova, Georgia, maybe even the Baltic states.
So this is about way more than just Ukraine. We're talking about potential instability across a whole region.
Right. And then you have to factor in the impact on U.S.-Russia relations. Things were already pretty bad. And a deal that looks like the U.S. is selling out Ukraine would just make things worse.
So it's like this incredibly delicate balancing act.
Exactly.
And then on top of all that, you've got the political situation in the U.S. Trump promised to end the war, but now he's got to figure out how to actually do that. And it's way more complicated than just saying we're going to have peace.
It's got a lot of pressure on him. Some people are saying don't give an inch to Russia, while others are saying, why are we giving all this money to Ukraine?
It's like he's stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah. Any decision he makes is going to upset somebody.
So we've talked about the big picture, but let's zoom in on those specific peace plans. Each one seems to have its own set of risks and downsides.
Right. So let's start with Kellogg's plan, the one with the conditional U.S. aid to Ukraine. The idea is that Ukraine only gets the aid if they agree to negotiate with Russia.
Which kind of sounds like they're being forced into a deal they don't want.
Yeah, it raises some concerns about Ukraine's sovereignty.
And it could really damage the relationship between the U.S. and Ukraine.
Zelensky might start thinking, hey, the U.S. isn't really our friend.
And then he might turn to Europe for support instead.
Exactly. It could push Ukraine closer to the EU.
So Kellogg's plan could actually end up backfiring. Now, what about Vance's idea? The one with the demilitarized zone.
That one's a bit tricky. It would be super expensive to set up and maintain.
And who's going to provide all the troops to patrol it?
Right. And even if they do all that, is it really going to stop Russia from trying something again later?
Plus, it kind of just makes the division of Ukraine permanent.
Yeah, it's like saying, okay, we're going to stop fighting, but this line is here to stay.
And then there's Grenell's autonomous zones plan.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, I still don't really get what he was talking about.
It was definitely the vaguest of the three proposals. And that lack of clarity is a problem because it's hard to assess the potential risks and benefits.
Like, what would these zones actually look like? How much power would they have? Who would run them?
Yeah, there are a lot of unanswered questions.
It feels like it could create even more instability and conflict.
It's definitely a risky proposition.
So we've got all these plans, and they all seem to have some serious flaws. At this point, it's starting to feel like peace might not even be possible.
It's definitely a challenging situation. But I think it's important to remember that peacemaking is a process, not an event. There are rarely any easy answers, especially in a situation like this.
So where do we go from here? Is there any hope for a peaceful resolution to this whole thing? I mean, is peace even possible? We just spent the last hour talking about all the reasons why it's not going to work.
It's true. It's a really tough situation, but I don't think we should give up hope just yet.
Okay, but how can you be so optimistic?
Well, I think sometimes we get so caught up in the complexities of these situations that we forget about the human element.
What do you mean?
Any peace deal that gets forced on Ukraine from the outside that doesn't actually have the support of the Ukrainian people themselves, it's not going to last.
Right. It can't just be about drawing lines on a map and calling it a day.
Exactly. It has to address those deeper issues, like you mentioned before, the historical grievances, the cultural divisions, the security concerns.
So it's more about building trust than anything else.
Yeah, I think trust is a huge part of it, but it also takes strong leadership, a willingness to compromise on everyone's part, and maybe a little bit of luck.
And what about the rest of the world? What role do they play in all this?
Oh, the international community is crucial. You need the US, Europe, and all the other major players to be on the same page. They need to be putting pressure on both Russia and Ukraine to come to the table and negotiate in good faith.
But it can't just be about pressure, right?
No, they also need to be providing support.
Like financial aid,
Yeah.
military equipment.
All of that, but also support for the peace process itself, helping to facilitate dialogue, providing mediators, things like that.
It's starting to feel like this is way bigger than just us, you know? Like, what can we as individuals actually do to help?
That's a great question, and it's easy to feel powerless in a situation like this. But I think the first step is to stay informed.
Keep reading those articles.
Yeah, but also try to get information from a variety of sources.
No, like, don't just listen to people who already agree with us.
Exactly. Seek out different perspectives, challenge your own assumptions.
Okay, so stay informed. What else?
Support humanitarian efforts.
Oh, right. There are all those organizations doing amazing work on the ground.
Exactly, and they need our help.
So donate to a reputable charity or maybe volunteer sometime.
Even just spreading awareness, talking to your friends and family, sharing information online can make a difference.
So keep the conversation going, basically.
Yeah, the more people who understand what's happening in Ukraine, the more pressure there will be on leaders to actually find a solution.
What about contacting our elected officials? Does that actually do anything?
It can, especially if enough people do it.
So write to our senators and representatives and tell them we care about Ukraine and we want them to support a peaceful resolution.
Exactly. And you can also get involved with organizations that are working to promote peace and diplomacy.
Cool. So there are actually quite a few things we can do, even if we're not like diplomats or politicians.
There are, and it's important to remember that peace isn't just the absence of war. It's about creating a world where everyone feels safe and secure and respected.
That's a good point. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the whole Ukraine peace deal situation back in January 2025, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from all of this?
I think the main takeaway is that peace is a process. It's not something that just happens overnight. It takes time and effort and a lot of hard work from a lot of people.
And even though this was just a snapshot in time and things have probably changed a lot since then.
It's still valuable to understand the historical context, the key players, the challenges that were at play.
Yeah, gives us a better understanding of how we got to where we are today.
And hopefully it inspires us to keep working towards a more peaceful future.
Well said. That's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and a huge thank you to our expert for sharing their insights.
It was my pleasure.
And to all of you listening out there, remember, peace is everyone's responsibility. So stay informed, stay engaged, and keep the conversation going. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.